Check, check. All right. Yeah, I'm on. You know, sometimes justice comes over periods of time, maybe weeks, months. And then other times, justice comes instantaneously. It happens just like that. On these cold winter days that I lament somewhat because of my Filipino blood, I think back to warmer days. I think back to times when the sun was out and it was hot and shiny, and it was just all the time in the world to be outside and do all kinds of things. One of those days, I was a 12-year-old, and we used to ride horses a lot, my family, on the island of Puerto Rico. We used to bring them down the beaches and then up this trail into the military base out there near Aguadilla in Puerto Rico. I remember having a horse in our backyard because we just rid him out over there, and sitting on this horse, wanting to move it to a different location, and becoming very angry with the horse. Her name was Rosie Palomino, and she was just being a horse, as horses do. And have any of you ever been clotheslined? Do you know what that means? When somebody, maybe you guys who know wrestling and stuff like that, you know what being clotheslined is, right? When somebody runs up to you and does like this, and then you get caught on the neck. Well, I was on this horse, and I was trying to move it, and I was not paying attention to what was in front of me. And lo and behold, it was a literal clothesline. So the horse, just being a horse, obeyed and went forward, and I literally got clotheslined, dragged off the horse from my neck down. There was instantaneous justice for my anger towards this beast, something that I should have been aware of. My dad always would tell me, don't get mad at the horses, it doesn't make much sense. What are you going to do to them? It's a 1,000-pound beast. You're not going to be able to do much, in terms of your anger. You're just a 12-year-old kid. But I tried, and there was instantaneous justice. Getting clotheslined off a horse. I'll tell you, I never did that again. Never got mad at horses again. Doesn't make too much sense to do that. But what we read in Scripture this morning, what we come to in 2 Samuel chapter 6, is something that has troubled a lot of folks as they come to the Word, as they come to study and to understand. This chapter actually qualifies as one of the more difficult passages of Scripture. We're taken aback at this harsh action of God and what we might regard as a merciless act of justice. On the surface, we see Uzzah doing what appears as a good deed, and God responding with swift vengeance. We also see David in what appears as inappropriate behavior before God, suffering no ill consequences. You see, the Ark of the Covenant had been captured by the Philistines before this, nearly 20 years in the incident in 1 Samuel chapters 4 through 7, before David became king. The Ark was Israel's national treasure and the most sacred object that it had. It was the presence of God among His people. It was kept in the tabernacle, in the most holy place, a curtained-off location where only the high priest would enter in on Yom Kippur, on the Day of Atonement. The Philistines captured the ark, but soon gladly sent it back after God destroyed their idol, the god Dagon. And the people were stricken with tumors. Abinadab was housing the ark in Kireth Jearim, approximately about 20 miles west of Jerusalem, after its return from the Philistines. When David established his throne in Jerusalem after Saul and everything that had gone on there, he determined to bring back the Holy Ark to his new capital, to provide the focus for worship and a rallying point for the nation. He wanted the glory of God back in Israel. David's mission is an important holy task. The day David brought the ark back to Jerusalem was perhaps the greatest day of his kingly life. The ark was placed on an ox cart. The oxen pulling the cart stumbled, and the ark slid and was about to fall on the ground, and Uzzah, one of the priests charged with transferring the ark, put out his hand to prevent the ark from striking the ground. Then came the blunt, hard sentence that we read here in 2 Samuel chapter 6, verse 7. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah because of his irreverent act. Therefore, God struck him down, and he died there beside the ark. We might have expected God to thank Uzzah. Instead, he executed him on the spot. David called off the mission immediately. Who would dare continue after that? 3 months later, David completed the task, and this time with extravagant celebration. We read that David danced before the Lord with all his might, accompanied by the shouts and the trumpets in verse 14, like the shofar makes from the ram's horn, those kind of things. The Ark of the Covenant was the occasion for death and then also a dance. But we come back to this situation with Uzzah. By the way, the title of our sermon, what David announced there as a place, Perez Uzzah, literally translates into the outburst against Uzzah. And this is what David saw. He saw this outburst of God against Uzzah. Now, what was Uzzah's sin? It's tempting to say that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Uzzah was slain for irreverence, is what we see in verse 6. The Hebrew people largely regarded the ark as a good luck object. Uzzah saw himself as one of those whose job it was to take care of God. He had God in a box and assumed responsibility for keeping him safe from the mud and dust of the world. Uzzah ignored, perhaps defied, Moses' most clear directions on the proper handling of the ark. It was not to be touched by human hands, but carried by Levites using poles inserted through rings attached to the ark. Only the poles could be touched. In his book, The Holiness of God, R.C. Sproul points out, Uzzah assumed that his hand was less polluted than the earth. But it wasn't the ground that would desecrate God. It was the touch of man. Uzzah was Kohathite. Boy, I got to get that pronounced right. A clan within the tribe of Levi, which had been consecrated by God to handle the logistics of moving the tabernacle, the tent, and its furnishings. The book of Numbers clearly warns that they may not touch the holy objects or they will die. Only the Levitical priests were allowed to carry the most holy objects. The Kohathites were not to even look at the ark, according to Numbers 4. In the Mosaic Law, there were clear warnings about the ark, but they went foolishly unheeded. So this is not something that Uzzah didn't know. This is not something that Uzzah could have claimed, I didn't know I wasn't supposed to do that. Nothing like that. Uzzah substituted what he might have regarded as a more efficient innovation. He had greater technology, if you will, but his method was impersonal. He replaced consecrated persons with a machine. The cart was new, and the priest may have figured it was appropriate method. We're not opposed to technology, but what Uzzah had done here was fatally discovered that he was not in charge of God. His method was contrary to God's law and offensive to God. This harsh incident raises a significant doctrine and a key attribute about God, which I believe we can focus on and understand this morning. God is, first and foremost, holy, and not to be trifled with, not just to be put into some box within our mind. He is holy. We wisely enter his presence with the awareness that he is according to Scripture, a consuming fire. We do not utter his name loosely or lightly or in a profane manner. When the captured ark arrived in Israeli territory, the town of Beth Shemesh gawked at it. The text implies that they opened it to view its sacred contents, the tablets, the pot, the manna, etc. 70 people were slain by God at Beth Shemesh because of this, which ought to have been a warning to Uzzah. Uzzah knew about this. He knew that trifling with the holy items of God had its consequences. The incident was no accident. The falling of the ark was a sign. God's way of halting that procession which David had put on. God was not objecting to the intended relocation. Jerusalem. He was opposed to the inappropriate means of transport, which Uzzah had provided. The Philistines earlier also used an ox cart to return the captured ark, but their ignorance was overlooked. Without human assistance, the ark was divinely guided straight back to Israel. The Jews, on the other hand, ought to have known how to properly treat what was sacred. The lesson here is that we have access to God, but not casual familiarity. And this reminds me of preachers sometimes that get up on the TV and talk about having these casual conversations to God while they're shaving or brushing their teeth or whatever. God is not like that. God is holy. We do have access to Him. But when we speak to Him, there has to be some reverence. Not when we're just getting changed and putting on our clothes and in the shower or whatever. Yeah, you can call out to Him if you need to, but realize you're not just talking to anybody. You're talking to somebody who is holy, somebody that is sacred. And we have to remember that first and foremost, God is holy. We may boldly approach God, but with reverence and respect. Perhaps we're like Uzzah in the way we casually regard the sacred. We come to church expecting to be entertained. The complaint that church is boring is never made by that church is boring is never made by people in awe of God. Uzzah thought he was protecting the ark. Perhaps we're also like Uzzah in our need to defend God before unbelievers. You don't defend a lion. You simply get out of his way, right? David became upset at Uzzah's death. The word angry in verse 8 might better be translated as distressed, maybe even befuddled, if you want to use that word. That better fits what we have there in verse 9, which reveals David's confusion and despair. How can the ark come to me? This is what David cries out. David clearly realized that God was offended, and he was not willing to further risk divine displeasure. David did not know how to progress, and so he immediately halted the operation and placed the ark in a nearby home of Obed-Edom, who was a Levite. Then David did his homework. At his second attempt to bring the ark to Jerusalem, he followed the Mosaic law and obeyed its strict and clear instructions regarding proper handling of this sacred treasure. It's hard not to notice that while God does not tolerate Uzzah's action, He tolerates David's anger. David's anger did not get him killed because he was treating God as God and not as a box to be manipulated. When the ark finally arrived in Jerusalem the correct way, Michal saw David's dance and despised her husband. Michal was David's first wife and the daughter of King Saul. Perhaps her contempt came from her father. She is 3 times in this chapter called the daughter of Saul, implying that she was not behaving as David's loyal wife, but his opponent like a true daughter of Saul. She apparently felt that her husband was getting carried away in his enthusiasm, acting undignified. Those who have no reason to dance before God despise those who do. David removed his royal robes and wore an ephod, a priestly garment, to mark the religious significance of the occasion. He was willing to look humble, common, and undignified in the eyes of some in order to fully express his delight in the Lord. His dance in this occasion is not inappropriate. His heartfelt worship, however, repelled Michal. Her displeasure destroyed their marriage ultimately. David does not divorce her, but they ceased to live as husband and wife, and she remained childless. Now, as we go through this story, it's a difficult one, but there's a principle that we have to understand in Scripture. When God's presence is there amongst God's people, there is more light, and more light exposes more darkness. So if there are errors in our ways and how we do things, that light will consume the darkness. And so we see the results of what happens here with Uzzah as he reaches out and touches the ark, for which he knows he shouldn't have had on that ox cart, for which he knows he cannot touch the ark. He's forbidden to do such a thing. There's instantaneous action. Now, do we see in Scripture at other times where God acts an outburst like this? There are plenty of times that there are outbursts when the presence of God is made real and is there amongst God's people. We think of some New Testament stories in regards to that, of that couple who decided to defraud the disciples. Do you remember them? Ananias and Sapphira, you remember them? That action was also an outburst from God because God's presence was obviously there as they were trying to hold back a portion of what they had dedicated to the Lord. When the presence of God is real amongst you and you still decide to do contrary to what He has declared to be right, well, there are consequences for that. There's just a little formula, and it's something that we can keep in mind and understand as we move on in our life. We have to do the right thing for the right reason. If we start to mess that up, if, say, we're doing the right thing for the wrong reason, well, we have all kinds of issues. Or if we do the other thing where we're doing the wrong thing for the right reason, well, then we have all kinds of issues there. There's an old saying that says, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And it's true. There are a dozen things that we can do that are wrong that would seem to be right because we seem to be helping somebody or doing something that seems to be right, but we're doing the wrong thing for maybe the right reasons. Our intentions may be good, but the outcome, of course, is just bad. Or we may be doing, and this is more common, I believe, we may be doing the right thing. We may be keeping Sabbath. We may be eating a vegetarian diet. We may be doing, prayer meetings. We may be doing Bible studies. We may be doing all this other stuff. If we're just doing it for the recognition of the people or trying to get recognized by our conference or pastor or whoever just to get a pat on the back, well, that's the wrong reason to be doing anything like that. The reason we do religious activities is not because we want recognition or we want to be patted on the back. It's because we know it's the right thing to do. We know that bringing souls to the Lord is the right thing. I'd like to conclude with a story this morning. I remember back in Southern College, where I went to back in the 1995, 96, 97, I remember a particularly heated argument. And theologians, when they get together, especially in school, great time to argue and to butt heads, I don't even remember what this particular argument was about that we were getting into. It was a group of my friends. We were sitting around after class. I want to say it had to do with something with Daniel 2, getting into the great statue and everything like that, about the toes of the statue, something like that. And they were vehemently arguing back and forth until one of my friends, realized he was wrong. And in his southern twang, he was from Tennessee, in southern twang, he leaned over and looked at my friend who had argued him into the ground. Have you ever been to one of those arguments where somebody just argues the other person into the ground? And he said to him, in his southern twang, he said, "You may be right, but you're not right." And that made a world of sense to me. He was right, but the way that he had proven himself right was just not right. The way that we had argued and carried on and things like that. It's important that we do the right thing for the right reason. So I ask you this morning, why are you here? Why do you come? What's your purpose? What has God called you to? Are you doing the right thing for the right reason? Or if you're on the other end of the spectrum where you're doing something wrong, but you think you're doing it for a good reason. You're doing the wrong thing with good intentions. My friends, you're only fooling yourself. Ultimately, those wrong things will catch up to you, and there are consequences for the mistakes that we make. So I want to plead with you. God does have sometimes instantaneous justice. But there's one place where there was instantaneous justice that we can always look to and be reassured that God does care for us. And of course, that's the cross. Instantaneous justice for everybody's sins in one place, there on the cross for us. There's forgiveness for you and me, no matter how wrong we've gone, no matter what mistakes we've made, no matter where we've ended up at in our lives, there is justice that God has meted out on Jesus for our behalf and for our sake. I'd plead with you to turn to Him, because there's no other hope in this life but through Jesus Christ. With that, let's go ahead and have our closing hymn, which is number 12. Joyful, joyful.